All right, so the last bit is identifying server-side technologies. Now, one thing you can do is connect to a server on the right port, and a lot of services will then respond with a banner. So, for example, web pages have a header, and it'll tell you right here what server and sometimes what version is being used, although it is considered a good security practice to change that into just something generic, because there's no real need to advertise what version of everything you're using like this. But a default install will often advertise exactly what versions you're using. There are tools to do that. HTTP Recon is a tool that will connect and try to find out all the versions of everything by just looking for a series of clues. You can tell things like WordPress versions and Joomla versions, often from subtle clues on the page, and there are tools that have all these things built in. One's called Wappalizer, which is a browser extension, and it will then tell you what kind of technology is used, including what JavaScript libraries are being used these days. Yeah, Nmap will grab those banners too. Yeah, these things will look and detect more web versions, but Nmap will get the port numbers and the things listening on ports. And file extensions tell you things. ASP is Microsoft Active Server Pages, JSP is Java, here's Cold Fusion, PHP, Perl, Python, and so on. There's a lot of file extensions that give you a clue what kind of technology is being used. And there are often error messages. This is a very common flaw, that a page has a default error message that tells you too much. Years ago, I tested a lot of college web servers and found a bunch of farmer redirectors and told them. And then I wanted to check political parties. I tried the Democrats and they were fine. I went to the Republican National website, and all I did was add like an extra character to the URL, and the whole page turned into screaming red source code. And I said, this is garbage, and I think I better stop poking around. But Lotus Domino, I don't know about that. But anyway, this is what you see with ASP. Just change something on the page and you'll get an error, often giving, yeah, Lotus is email, yeah. I just didn't see that. Was that here? Oh, it is, yeah. That's pretty out of date, isn't it? Well, yeah, that's, by the way, your book is pretty badly out of date. So there are some examples that are way back. That's why you see things in there like Flash. This book is still right, though. People say almost every new vulnerability, you find it was in this book. But yes, this book is pretty old. It would be nice if somebody would make an updated one. All right. So here you have an unrecognized file extension. This just tells you the page cannot be found. But again, it shows you it's IIS at the bottom. So default error messages often tell you information they shouldn't. Inside your IIS, you can specify what different file extensions are mapped to, and you may get different error messages for different DILs. So here's this stuff with commas is VigNet. I don't know if people still use VigNet. I've never come across it. And Java servlets, Oracle Application Server, Cold Fusion. Here's Ruby on Rails. Ruby on Rails was all the hotness, except a few years ago. Inside what will tell you what stuff. This is inside the IIS server, where you tell it which DIL to use to interpret each file extension, I think. Yeah, VigNet, you've come across that on a modern site. Oh, good. I've never come across it, but you know, I'm not that experienced, so good. VigNet should still be used. Here, the session tokens will tell you. Java session token, ASP session token, and so on. Cold Fusion and PHP, they'll tell you right there in the cookie. And people often use third-party functionality. One of the big ones I hear about is Magento. People use Magento for their shopping cart, and then they keep on getting hacking tools that steal the credit card numbers from Magento. It's a big deal. Anyway, people often use third-party services for all these common things, and they often have known vulnerabilities, and people often fail to update them. So here's some recommended steps. Identify all entry points for user input. Look at the query string format. Figure out how parameters are going in. Find all the other channels that allow data coming into the app. That's part of your attack surface. Then look at the banner and other software identifiers to try to find out what kind of server software is running, an HTTP print, and then look at the map of URLs to find extensions and such. This will give you a clue how to determine what the server's using. Here's HTTP print, which is pretty old. More modern tools are Nmap, Netcraft, and Shodan, and Wappalyzer to do the same thing, to give you information about what technology is being used on a server. So look at the session tokens, common technologies, cookie names, and so on, to get a clue what kind of technology is being used. And this is a Java server page, and it's got an order by parameter, which suggests that this stuff is going into a SQL command. So you might be able to do SQL injection, and there is expired equals 0. So that would suggest that changing is expired to 1 might show you old pages, which might be useful. And here you got one with ASPX. So that tells you it's Microsoft. It's got a template. Now this looks like a name and file extension, so this might be vulnerable to local file inclusion. We might be able to change this to traverse to a different directory and find other files. There's an edit equals false, so maybe edit equals true would show you something interesting. And there's a version number, so changing that might show you old versions of things. So those are all areas to explore. Here's a post sending some data up to send an email message. It's connecting to a PHP form, to an email server, and I have user controllable content in all the fields, so I could probably use this to send spam or other emails from the server. I control the from, I control the to, I control the message, so and I might be able to inject email headers all over the place there. Yes, please help. I'm trapped in, yeah, exactly. A student found this at City College one time, and I used it to send an email to a student that said it was from the White House and said, "Send the nukes now." So anyway, here you've got a URL. This is probably parameters in here using RESTful style parameters. It's probably like this: type equals media, ID equals 117, and so on. Change action, view, to like edit or add, and so on. Change the ID number. A low number like this is probably just a sequential counting number, so you can probably just go 116, 115 and find other objects. So code is often reused, or it's written by the same developer, so it uses the same naming scheme and such. So you can try injecting to see what filtering is in effect. There's often just going to be one universal filtering function used for the whole site, or a large part of it. If it obfuscates data, you might be able to find some place where you can enter a string and see the obfuscated data, and it might use the same obfuscation everywhere. Or you can just systematically vary values. This is how I broke into the Stitcher app years ago. The Stitcher Android app used the Caesar cipher to encrypt your password. And I reported it, and they said, "Well, what else should we use?" And I said, "Dude, there's this thing called HTTPS. You might have heard of it." And they switched to that. But anyway, for several years I was demonstrating that live at DEF CON and stuff, how they used Caesar cipher. So it was like really easy. I did a password of A and B and C, and you could just see the pattern. Anyway, errors are often too verbose and give too much information, like the SQL injection that we were looking at last time. You can learn a lot from the error messages it produces. There are Google dorks to find vulnerable websites. This is not much use for a targeted pen test of one server. This is just more for pranksters that want to just put their name on a lot of servers. But you can search for vulnerable versions of websites, pages where something illegal happened, error logs. Elma is a common log processor, and I read about this and found a bunch of vulnerable sites a few years ago where it would just post the entire URL of requests that had errors in it. So you could then send like a spam email with a defective link, and you could steal people's cookies that way. There's a ton of Google dorks, they call these, searches that will find vulnerable pages. And this is how people do mass defacements. So here was a Walmart one I found where you can just put a quote at the end, and you get a whole crash with all kinds of unnecessary information about the .NET they're using, an overly informative error message. So your app may use some consistent framework to filter the input, like a web application firewall, And so you might be able to figure them out and notice that they come from a different source. And they might be using client-side validation. We've talked about that. If you're using JavaScript in your browser, that you can use BERT to just change after that. And so that's not going to stop you. If you're using databases, you might get SQL injection. If they refer to file names, you might get local file inclusion, remote file inclusion, path traversal, stored cross-site scripting. Displaying user data often gives you reflected cross-site scripting. And dynamic redirects let you move from this page to another, and those redirection attacks mean that you can trick people into loading another page's content from a URL that looks like it's on this page. So they will get blamed for it. I tried explaining this to a bunch of high schools that had this vulnerability years ago. They just hang up on me. But I said, you guys have an uncontrolled redirect, which means people are using it to load like porn stuff and illegal content, and the URL starts with your domain name. So you will get blamed for it. You will eventually get blocked by Google and blocked by antivirus engines. Even though the bad stuff is not on your site, the unprotected redirect causes people's browsers to load the bad stuff and blame it on you. But anyway, I couldn't explain that to anybody before they'd hang up on me. Anyway, your social networking, you can try to use usernames with scripts in them, and you do brute force attacks or password spraying attacks where people dump a whole bunch of stolen passwords from one site and you just try using them on another site because a lot of people use the same password on multiple sites. And there are other things like predictable tokens. Then you can have horizontal and vertical privilege escalation. Horizontal is where you move from one user to another user, and vertical is where you move from a user up to administrator. And both of those are often possible. You can impersonate people. You can find data that's not encrypted. And there might be off-site links leaking information in the referrer header. And you might find other session flaws. Error messages often give you unnecessary information. Email lets you add an unexpected email or even a command to it. If you have native compiled code, then it might have the old classic flaws like memory corruption, like buffer overflows. And third-party components often have known vulnerabilities. This is a huge issue since the SolarWinds attack greatly raised people's awareness of supply chain attacks. If you use software, the software uses libraries, and those libraries use more libraries until you're using some stuff in open source on some foreign country that hasn't been updated in 5 years, and you don't really know that. So it's often the case that there are vulnerable components because of dependency issues, which is why there's now a big push for sites to get a software bill of materials where you really list all the libraries and all the versions that are used in this software so we can audit it and make sure that none of them have known vulnerabilities. And of course, web servers themselves have vulnerabilities and known bugs. And so here is an example. This page has an auth, and in here it's got forgot password, login, reset password, and so on. So in there, you can look at how it keeps track of that. How does it maintain the session? And with this issue not having enough time to audit before implementing. Well, yes, of course, that's the problem. That's why people rush things out and then they have problems later, especially if, like Facebook, their company philosophy is move fast and break things. Some companies have a quality control and security audit before things go out. Other people just rush out new features. I see the emails that went to Log4j authors. Oh, yes. Log4j was an open source product, and when it turned out to have vulnerability, everybody started yelling at them, and they're like, dude, nobody even paid us to make this. Yep, it's an issue. So that's why, in fact, I was just talking to a client today, and they said, we have a policy which our developers must learn about the use of open source software. And I think everybody needs to have that. If you use open source software, you could very well be using something vulnerable, even something malicious. You're using stuff from God knows who. Right, so here you've got parameters in core site stat. All these parameters, you could try varying them. And then there's home here, which is authenticated user content. So you might be able to figure out how your token determines who you are and change it to move into somebody else's account. We'll see a lot of examples of that as you go ahead. And icons and images, there you're going to find static images and websites, probably nothing interesting there, unless you are a Mazda, or what is it, Mazda or Honda or something, the one that will crash just from viewing an image. And in pub, you've got RESTful resources, and there's a numerical value at the end, so you could try changing it to reach other things. Yes, exactly right. That's what I found. It's an overwhelming amount of stuff. And if all you need is somebody to make a mistake somewhere here, and now there's a door into your website, that's why it tends to happen. And there's online shopping. Everything here is being handled the same way, so there's some kind of consistent software being used all over the place here. Yeah. Yes? That is Mazda. That was it. The Mazda. Mazda is the thing that crashes if you send it images without file extensions. All right. So let's take a look at the last Kahoot. Yep. Jordan is right. Nothing's ever 100% secure. But you might want to not use your radio until they put out an update or something. Your Mazda might be old enough to be safe. You know, my car is a 97, so I'm pretty safe in this regard. It doesn't have any smart features at all. Good. I'm pretty happy with my dumb car, especially reading all the horrible bugs in Teslas. I'll stick with my beat-up old car. Well, when I rent them, the smart features are kind of nice, but I'm happy enough with my old one. Yeah, heated seats, don't need them in California. All right. Yeah, zero trust theory, yeah. So, what browser extension will identify the web server technologies? Oh, a browser extension, I see. Okay. I had trouble reading that. That's Wappalizer. That's the browser extension to tell you what technologies are on a website. All right, which file extension would you find on a LAMP server? PHP, that's the P in LAMP. I used to use LAMP for almost everything. Almost all my website is LAMP. But now I was compelled by a client to learn Node and write my stuff in Node, so I have to start writing more stuff in Node now that I've learned that. Well, LAMP is common by sort of amateurs because it's easy. PHP is much easier to write in than other languages. It's also a lot less secure. And you know, WordPress uses PHP, and I think WordPress alone is like 10 or 20% of the internet. So it's definitely common. So what directory name would you find on an Oracle server? I get it by process of elimination. It's PLS. Yeah, and by the way, I was amazed. I wrote an app. It was like 30 lines of PHP, and they said convert it to Node, and it was 600 lines of Node. But I did it. Well, all this information's in the book for one thing, but it's really a matter of experience and practice. There's far too much information to get it all the first time. You just have to get some of it, and then you hit the same things again and again until you get more familiar with it. The hands-on projects also help to solidify some of the information. Yep. I wouldn't expect to learn all this stuff the first time. As you've noticed, there's too many little things to remember. Just get the general impression, and you fill in the details with experience as you work with it. That's what I do. All right, and so which name would indicate a Microsoft server? ASP, session ID. See, and this is worth mentioning. This is a fundamental problem with all these computer classes, all the ones I teach. There's too much information. You can't really get it all easily. So you just try to get some of it, and then you go over it again and again from different angles. Don't panic if you don't get it all. It takes time. All right. So Eileen has won twice. And Hema has won twice. Good. And Luan wins. Good. A lot of different people won today. All right.